Amazing. Well, for this next question, you may have to sort of indulge me a little bit, but so my favorite band of all time is the band Queen. I'm not sure if you're too familiar with Queen, Freddie
Enough,
Mercury.
yeah. I mean, a
Well,
popular band.
they released this song called 39, and this it's a sort of science fiction tale of these volunteer explorers who leave Earth in the year 39. I don't know, that could be, you know, way in the future. But they go out in search of a to explore this planet to sort of colonize it because the Earth is decaying. They come back and they're a year older and they're really excited to tell the Earth that they found this, you know, this new planet. We're all going to move there. They come back to find that 100 years have passed, that their families are all gone, that the Earth is sort of this small, grey, deteriorated planet. And I never really understood the concept of it. The song was written by Brian May, who is an astronomer, so obviously he loves the sort of sci-fi tales. But I never really understood it, and years later I heard that it was sort of playing on the theme of time dilation. I was
Hmm.
wondering if you could maybe explain that concept to someone like myself, if that's even possible.
Yeah, so let's remind people that the Brian May, the lead guitarist, right, and creative force behind Queen, as we now know it, he has a PhD in astrophysics. I think it's from University College London. I think I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, I'm not all that wrong. It's and that PhD he attained long after Queen was long after Freddie Mercury had died. He basically went back to school. He had a very strong interest in this, and I've met him only once, and I feel like we should have had more intersections of our lives. But it makes complete sense that the storyline would have come from him, because it's one of the fundamental things you learn in beginning of modern physics. And you take a class in modern physics, which would be relativity and quantum physics. This is physics discovered in the 20th century, as opposed to the 19th century or 18th century or 17th century, where the rest of classical physics was discovered. So all it says is you exist in space and you exist in time. Well, and that's not so weird to think of it that way, that you need two coordinates to localize you in this universe, a space coordinate and a time coordinate, right? So I don't want people to trip up on that, because we have an intuitive understanding of it. For example, if I say to you, hey, let's have lunch tomorrow at 12 noon. What is your next question to me?
Where?
Where? Okay. You knew that time alone was insufficient to establish our connecting in this universe. And by the same token, I'll say, hey, I'll meet you at Marty's pub. What's your next question to me?
When?
When? So we know intuitively that for us to meet, we have to provide a space coordinate and a time coordinate. They're fundamentally conjoined. All right, it turns out when you travel at high speeds and other people don't, then your coordinate system changes for you at a different rate than it does for others. So, what's the best example I can give? If you travel in space, your space coordinate is changing, and other people isn't. All right, that's not so weird. Well, if you travel fast, your time coordinate is changing too. We can show the equations that require that happen, and it's all traceable to Albert Einstein in 1905, his special theory of relativity. And we know it's real, and it works, and we have tested it. So, there is a speed and a time with which you can travel and stay away, where if you come back after one of your years, Earth could have aged 10 years, 100 years, or even 1,000 years, depending on how fast you moved. So in that sense, yes, we can go to the future, arbitrarily far into the future. We just can't, as far as we know, go into our own past. And that would be kind of dangerous if you think about it. Like, suppose you prevented your parents from meeting each other. Then you wouldn't be born enough to then go back into the past to prevent your parents from meeting each other. So that makes it one of the more fun time travel paradoxes that there is.
That's a good question. You know, there were times where it was difficult, and my husband's not, you know, jealous. However, it was kind of funny. And it was more of a joke. God rest his soul, Bill Bailey. He was, oh my gosh, he was such a sweet performer. But he's like, man, I think Bill's banged you like this month more than I have. Damn, Bill. So he, you know, so when we saw Bill, he's like, hey, bro, like, it was kind of funny, you know. So, you know, there's jokes. So he's like, but Bill was such a sweetheart, you know, and God, he's truly was one of the best. So, and he is missed. So those who didn't get a chance to work with him really missed out, because he was an awesome guy, cool guy. But yeah, there were definitely challenges, you know, because it's hard sometimes. You know, a part of me felt guilty, like, well, what if I enjoy this too much? Or, you know, but I'm supposed to. And he's like, you're supposed to enjoy your work. And I'm like, I know, but I feel kind of bad. Like sometimes I would feel bad, you know, because I never wanted him to feel anything less than the best, no matter who I was with. I don't, if they were like, you know, Mr. Ideal and maybe like what women see as ideal, you know, I just never wanted him to feel bad, or I didn't want him to ever feel hurt, or I never wanted to like bruise his ego, you know. And it you know, I feel like I try to do a good job. Don't get me wrong. There were times, you know, we may have had disagreements or, you know, things. But for the most part, I mean, he was really supportive, you know, so that was a good thing. But it can be challenging, you know. I'm experimenting. I mean, doing things like maybe I wouldn't have thought about on camera. So it's like I always would run things by him, like, hey, what do you think about this? And it's not that he controlled me, because he knows he's not doing that. We're not, you know, I think relationships aren't not about control. You know, it's a compromise, right? So I would, you know, run things by him just to kind of get his feel. And if I felt like maybe, you know, he wasn't feeling it, then I wouldn't do, you know, but for the most part, he's always had my back as far as like what he thought was good for my career, but never pushed, you know. So I feel like it was just the right amount of support, you know. But yeah, don't get me wrong. There are times like, oh yeah, a couple cocktails, got a little stupid. Yeah, guilty, you know. And I'm like, man, I fucked up, you know, just, you know, here or there, it happens, you know. And so, I mean, that's life, but I mean, not like infidelity. There's nothing, you know, like that. So it was good. So we're pretty solid.
And it makes me think to like really corny, you know, detective spy shows where the detective will bust the case by saying, oh, he looked to the left when he said that. Is there anything in terms of reading into that sort of stuff?
Not in reality, not for detecting lies, right? So there are ways that you can detect truth, because there are certain things that are very consistent that happen when you're detecting truth, right? So like, for example, Lewis, if I were to ask you right now, right, think back to a time that made you happy and tell me what you remember. Now stop right there. Your eyes moved up and to the right. I know with high probability that you were thinking a truthful thought when you did that. Because depending on if we're mirrored or not, your memory lives in like a spectrum, in our visual spectrum. So we kind of have this chronological left to right image in our head whenever we're referencing our own memories. Yeah. So when you looked up, and then from my point of view, you looked up and to the right, which may be up and to the left from your point of view, all that shows is that you're referencing that visual reference, because that visual reference exists physically behind your forehead. So you're looking up to reach that area behind your forehead. But whether you're looking left or right, all it tells me is whether you're referencing a part of your early life or a part of your recent life, right? So I don't know, when you started thinking about it, what came to your mind? Was it a childhood memory? Was it a recent memory? Was it an adult memory? What did you think of?
I was trying to think back to my childhood.
So if that's the case, then I'm guessing that we're actually mirrored, and you were looking up and to the left from the room where you're at.
That's right, yeah.
Right? That's a sign of truthful behavior. So when you hear people say that liars look up and to the right, that's not always the case. It depends on the question, and it depends on the baseline. But when I want to see if you're actually going to try to tell me an honest answer, I'm looking for you to reference your visual memory, your visual cortex. So I'm looking for you to look up, and then I can assess what part of your memory you're looking at based on the direction of your eyes.
Wow. You always reference your love for Bruce Lee, and I think a lot of kids these days get into martial arts. They've probably never seen Enter the Dragon. What is it about Bruce Lee that's captivated you so much?
Because of the way his mind works, you know, he would draw from things outside of martial arts to put things within martial arts into a better context. You know, his ability to apply philosophy to combat sports is something that most people don't do, and still don't do. You know, you can watch any of his movies really, but obviously Game of Death and Enter the Dragon are the two. You know, Enter the Dragon because that was the movie he completed and that he was able to really put his philosophy into. And then Game of Death because, you know, he says so much in that final fight scene. There are so many lessons for a martial artist in there. And, you know, even to this day, like I've spent the last 2 days researching Makhachev against Oliveira, and all the time I'm seeing things, and there'll be something that he said in Enter the Dragon, which it will present itself in my mind, and it will give me better clarity about his philosophy. Like it honestly is timeless. The things that he says, it's the same with you know, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. You know, of course, it was written, you know, hundreds of years ago, but there's a core truth to everything that he's saying, which is transferable. Another reason why The Art of War has become a book so popular in the business world, when in actuality it was written about warfare. You know, the transition from martial arts to daily life is not too difficult for me to do with most subjects. And Bruce Lee kind of had that in his mind. I mean, in the 60s, it's crazy to think. Like I just try and relate myself to how he was 32 when he died. I've just turned 40 and I'm still way, way behind where he was at. I can't imagine how he arrived at the thinking that he had in the 70s, you know, while he was, you know, in his 30s, late 20s, early 30s. With the lack of resources that we've got. I mean, imagine sitting the guy down in front of YouTube or UFC Fight Pass for a day. His mind would be absolutely blown. But his philosophies still ring true. You know, the things that he talks about, Enter the Dragon, that, you know, that first scene when he's walking along with the monk, you know, when the time comes I do not hit, it hits all by itself. I used to listen to that when before school in the morning. I'd have that tape playing over and over again every day. It'd get to the end of the week and I'd just rewind it and start it again on the Monday morning. And I've listened to those lines over and over again. And even now, sometimes they click in my head and I'm going, oh, okay, that's what he meant. That's what he meant. You know, a fight is like a small play, but played seriously. You know, if you take it too seriously, if you're too tense, you can't be playful. You know, there's a lot to learn from the animal kingdom as well, which is where, you know, the roots of Shaolin come back in, and watching animals train and play and kind of learn their, you know, martial craft without them even knowing what they're doing. I think a lot of people take training too seriously these days. And I think Bruce Lee was able to kind of hold on to it as a philosophical venture, as opposed to a kind of a hard-headed, we're going to fight and see who's the toughest.
Remarkable that you were actually inside this gas chamber as this.
Well, I wasn't in the gas chamber. I was in the anteroom. I was in the waiting room. If I were inside, I don't know what would happen unless they stopped gassing that day. I don't know. But I was in the waiting room. And I remember you know, a child doesn't have any theory or intellectual thought process. We know, we feel physically left, right. Like I remember walking down the steps a little bit, or tiny steps, and I remember the big room with all the numbers all around for the hooks, and I couldn't read the numbers. So I remember the the physical thing. And I remember them shouting, you know what they were shouting about? And the cold waiting and waiting. And I remember it was daytime when we went, came back at night. Because at night, I didn't see the women, I heard them. And again, my mother asked me, and I remember her voice, and I told her. Again, the reason it's so detailed, because I'm low and short, so I see only the bottom, everything around. I don't see up. You know, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? Because I thought of that.
I just need to help Tova a little bit with the narrative there, because what happened was when Tova went to the gas chamber with those children, she went past the area of the camp where her mother was with all of these other people, and her mother shouted out to her saying, "Where are you going?" And Tova said, "We're going to the gas chamber." And then, you know, the women were astonished when they came back a few hours later.
Right. And I was sort of apologetic almost. I said, they couldn't do it this time, they'll do it next time. I felt the job wasn't done, whatever it was supposed to have been done. So.
What makes a life worth living?
Wow. Well, I think working with the flow of life rather than struggling with the mechanism of life. There are two ways in which life can be thought of, at least. And the one that is most commonly thought of is that of it being some kind of a machine that we can use, if we're lucky. But much more than that, I feel it is a flow, and we haven't time to unpack why that is so important, but in my work I do talk about it. And it's the ability to go with the flow in a creative way that allows that core of humanity in one to flourish. And this will be that one has a nourishing, deep relationship with other human beings and with nature and with the realm of whatever you like to call it, the sacred, the divine. I believe those are the things that make us fulfilled as a human being. The social, the relationship with nature and the relationship with the sacred or divine. And it's not just my opinion, as I show at length. There's masses of evidence that these three things are the most important for making people happy, giving them psychological health, giving them physical health, which is astonishing, but it's true, and making them feel fulfilled and able to be resilient in meeting whatever interesting adventures life throws in our way. So it might, at first glance, be fairly obvious why so many of us are so stressed, so unfulfilled, so anxious, so depressed, because we've actually done our best to destroy social cohesiveness. We've done our best to vandalize and subdue nature, and we box ourselves up in little urban boxes instead of living alongside it, in the rhythms of it, in the depths of communion with it. And we've also decided that really only perhaps simpletons still believe that there might be something like the divine or a soul or God, whereas in my view, only simpletons dismiss that possibility. I don't say they have to embrace it, but I think what gives away that people aren't really thinking very well and are completely under the sway of the left hemisphere is people who just outright fundamentalist atheists, very much like fundamentalist believers, be they Muslim, Christian, or anything else. Fundamentalism is the dogma of the left hemisphere. Getting away from that, leading a much more subtle, nuanced life is the one that I would suggest we try to cultivate.
What comes with being the son or the brother of a public figure? Is there imposter syndrome in there? Is there insecurity? Because I imagine from the outside looking in, I know a lot of people think that must be all sunshine and rainbows, but you know, when you flip and you're actually in that situation, I imagine it's, you know, it's not the case.
No, it certainly isn't the case that that it's all sunshine and rainbows. You know, there's positive elements of it, and there's negative elements. It was a dramatic change in my family life in 2016 when my dad became famous. You know, there were reporters lined up down the streets, and for a very long time, and honestly, it hasn't really stopped since then. So it's been 6 years of not personally being in the spotlight, but certainly you know, some of the most important people in my life, and being in the spotlight, and so that's been difficult in a variety of ways. You kind of, well, you lose the relationship that you previously had with them, just because the whole context has shifted, and so it's been a learning process, and something that you kind of, I mean, with all relationships, you have to work to maintain them as situations change. And so this is just an extreme version of that. And so that's been tough, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. And when people get famous and go into the public spotlight, it's a dangerous thing to do. You know, so many people who become public run into issues with, well, I mean, just all sorts of issues. You don't have to look very far on the internet to find, you know, a ton of examples of that going wrong. So staying grounded, maintaining those personal relationships, not leaving all your old friends behind, right? I think that's a big one, is keeping the connection to your community and making sure that you don't lose that. That's been a big thing for me. But I mean, there's been positive elements too. It's been wonderful to see my dad's ideas make such an impact in the world, because obviously they were the values that I was brought up on, a lot of them, and so it's very cool to see those be magnified and be taken up by so many people, and I think that over the last year and a while, we've been managing to find more of a balance in the way that we manage our personal relationships as a family, and that's still a work in progress, but hopefully we can continue to build on that and improve that, not lose it to the crowd.
Going back a little bit to, you know, we were talking about books there and how you studied subjects and you developed all these new skills whilst in a place that is designed to take the hope out of people. And you know, once you were given the sentence of death, and I remember you put this spin on it that I couldn't believe, and you said that you were going to study the dictionary until you could give the best speech for your death penalty. Like, that is wild. And what was that process like of studying the dictionary and trying to teach yourself this amazing language so you can speak so eloquently? Like, what is the purpose behind that for you?
In the aftermath of being attacked as a child, I developed aphasia. Aphasia affects the process of language. And it's really strange for a person to have aphasia to be a really good reader, because it causes dyslexia. So despite the fact that I read over 9,000 books before I stopped counting, like literally, I shouldn't have been able to do that mentally, because aphasia blocks the process and retention of memory from reading, because reading is a artificial process we as humans develop. Language is an auditory process. That's why you still hear things while you're reading. Yeah, the mind is complex. So the crazy thing about all this was the dictionary had to be able to give me enough words to search my mind for so that I can compose a death speech, because they were going to put me to death. Now, I was only going to have a short amount of time to try and hold my shit together as a 20-year-old kid when they put me in the electric chair and then flip the switch. So at first, I used to practice sitting upwards with my head up against the wall with my eyes closed and try and come up with something. It was so hard, Lewis. It was so terrifying. How am I going to tell people I forgive them for murdering me for something I didn't do and then tell them who I am all in a minute? Like, how am I going to do this? Like, it was driving me nuts. And it wasn't until I learned about neutrinos and how they pass through the earth and everything else, because they're particles emanating from the sun and they don't have any boundaries. They pass through any hard surface you think, diamonds, nothing stops this thing. And that Japanese scientist had hollowed out a mountain in Japan to study the rate of neutrinos that pass through the earth. When I found out about that, I began practicing my death speech because I had empowered myself at that point to overcome my speech impediment. And I had this beautiful speech ready for them, boy. It was all based on forgiving them for not knowing that I was as beautiful as a neutrino passing through the earth, and I could forgive them for their ignorance without having to do much more than explain in this beautiful, profound way my elevation to them by speaking to them in a manner they could have never fathomed themselves speak. But then came the torment of practicing his speech for 20 years, and then they kicked me off the stage and they took the microphone off my hands and they said I couldn't make the speech. So I went to the mountains and I practiced it one time only. I drove this Jeep all the way up into the mountains and I got up on this giant boulder overlooking this mountain. And I practiced my speech one time perfectly, beautifully. And I burst out crying because I realized right at that moment, I would never be this free. I would never appreciate being this free because I just got out of prison. There's no way I could ever feel this way again. And I was heartbroken because I could never be as free as I was the day I gave my speech. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.